Welcome to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre's podcast series. My name is Mdunduli, the Centre's Education Officer. And welcome to the first part of our Focus on Democracy series. Freedom of speech is one of the greatest and important facets in any democratic constitution. However, the line between free speech and hate speech can be blurred when democracy and its principles are being subverted. In the decades following 1945, it seemed that the concept and practice of the system of democracy was undeniably inevitable for most of the world's nations, as the slogan, "Never Again," became the slogan that reverberated around the world. Over time, the world witnessed the crumbling of numerous authoritarian regimes and systems of colonialism, racism, and apartheid. However, fast forwarding to the present, the world has been witness to different types of authoritarian uprisings that chip away at the development of democracy around the world. In this podcast series, which we've entitled Sleepwalking Through the Assault on Democracy, Dangerous Speech, we will engage with experts in this field in a dialogue and attempt to answer some critical questions as to what it is we can do as we bear witness to these assaults on democracy. I am pleased to welcome our esteemed experts and panelists to unpack this topic. Firstly, we have Director Tali Nates, Founder and Executive Director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre in South Africa. We have Professor Bjorn Krondorfer, who's the Director of the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University and Endowed Professor of Religious Studies in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies, Flagstaff, USA. And we have Professor Andrea Petot, who is professor in the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University in Vienna, Austria, and a Doctor of Science of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And then last but not least, we have Professor Steve Carr, who is the Director of the Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Purdue University in Fort Wayne, USA. Everyone, welcome to this first of many dialogues on this topic. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just begin by asking each of you to introduce yourselves and tell us where you are located geographically as well as your work? Maybe I'll start with Director Tali Nates.
Thank you so much, Mdu, for having us. And it is wonderful to work with my colleagues, Bjorn, Andrea, and Steve, in this very important issue about safeguarding democracy in our world. I am in Johannesburg, South Africa, and speaking to you today from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre. It's wonderful to be here.
And then Professor Bjorn Krondorfer.
Hi, I'm Bjorn. I was born in Germany. I came to the United States in 1983 and have been working and living here. Now the director of an institute that was founded by a Holocaust survivor from Poland in Arizona, United States.
Thank you. And then Professor Petot.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation. So I'm working for the Central European University, which was forced to move from Budapest to Vienna, from one European Union country to another because of the authoritarian illiberal state. But at the moment, I'm in Bielefeld in Germany because I got this fellowship in the Institute for Advanced Studies of the University of Bielefeld. Thank you.
And then lastly, Professor Carr, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Madhu, and thank you so much for hosting this podcast. So I'm director of the Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Purdue University, Fort Wayne in Indiana. And we are a regional campus Also should point out that our center is the only academic center in Indiana that's exclusively devoted to the study of the Holocaust and other genocides. Thanks for having me here.
Wow, it's a pleasure. Wow, thank you for introducing yourselves to us. I just want to start with Professor Petrou. So could you just briefly explain the title? So the title of this series has been titled Sleepwalking Through the Assault of Democracy, Dangerous Speech. Please explain the concept behind this title and this podcast, and why did you choose the title?
Thank you. I think that there are not really concepts, but emotions and aspirations. And from this introduction, the listeners might not have the impression that these four people whom you invited to this podcast are actually the Vanguards, top-notch scholars of the scholarship in Holocaust and genocide studies. And we all united in this issue of being also very outspoken in public affairs and also as public intellectuals. And we have been working in different constellations together in the previous years. And we were totally amazed by the particular developments. And what historians can do is looking at the past and trying to understand what's happening in the present. And it's also a kind of professional credo that you are not only writing peer-reviewed articles, but you try to do other things as well, including public outreach. So, and also because we are historians who have been working on the history of genocide and Holocaust, we also recognize sometimes that reading the newspapers, that watching the news, that we have seen something like this before. And the issue of historical analogy, and I think we will be, reflecting on the methodological issues at a certain point. Historical analogies can be very misleading, but sometimes very helpful. And we don't have anything else at the moment than historical analogies to basically compare and contrast what's happening around us in the world. And the concept of sleepwalking was basically coming from this feeling of responsibility, sometimes outrage, sometimes, feeling that we have seen that and it did not end well. So we just thought that we should be tracing those elements of the past where we can learn from it. And or we can say that is totally different what we actually experience now. And simply it's an outcry, a protest, and a statement against neutrality, kind of appeasement and the sleepwalking, what we very often see nowadays.
So that concept of historical analogy, can you just explain for our listeners a little bit of what you mean by that term, historical analogy?
Historical analogies are when you are saying this is the same like it happened in the past. So it's a very simple argumentative structure. We have seen something similar in the past, so what we see now is the same. Like this system is fascist, that political action is authoritarian. So using this kind of analogies of the past, understanding the present, is really complicated in a sense that what kind of concepts and terms you are using to understand particular realities. And historical analogies are sometimes useful because they help you to draw conclusions and to understand different chains of events and different structural impacts, but sometimes extremely dangerous because it's a kind of cradle for anti-intellectualism, because you just say, this is like the same, this is like fascist, or this is like authoritarian, and you stop thinking of the present situation, and that is a real kind of anti-intellectual approach to our present and, more importantly, towards our future.
I want to bring in, thank you for that, Professor Petro. I want to bring in everyone else. And as you've mentioned as well, all of you are scholars working in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies or genocide education. And each of you come to this topic, in this topic from a different particular perspective. And so I want to maybe bring in Director Tali Nates. Could you explain, and then maybe other people can answer as well, could you explain how this approach leads to concerns about present-day genocide and prevention efforts, and how these relate back to what we call identity-based violence and mass atrocities?
So we in South Africa, of course, after years of colonialism, of apartheid, of racism, we can recognize certain events, certain words, certain trends, perhaps, and it can light a warning light for us. So I just want to continue from what Professor Petro said about analogies and about connections, perhaps, between historical events. And I will start with the example of what is happening at the moment in Zambia, but also in South Africa. In Zambia, we will have a general elections in August of this year. And there was violence in the last general elections, but what is worrying now, together with the pandemic, together with Corona, and the situation all around us, is that words and phrases that we used in, for example, Rwanda in the 1990s, leading up to the genocide against the Tutsi that started on the 7th of April of 1994. So dangerous language, sentences like, all opposition party members are snakes. This person is a cockroach. Okay, now this language is intensifying. It started late last year. And if you open now the media, the newspapers in Zambia, and I opened lately, just a few days ago, to see what is happening, the words are intensifying. These analogies of words used by Kangera and by Radio RTLM in Rwanda are intensifying, used again and again. And I'm bringing it now to South Africa. And I think that you can also speak about it, the use by opposition parties here in our own country with the same words. Words of snakes, cockroaches, you know, you are not human, you're not part of us, you are the other, and violent words. You need to die, you know, you need to go away for us to exist. So these are worrying trends, and like Andrea said, we had heard those words before. And the minute we hear those words again, we don't say that it is exactly like Rwanda. We just have a red light that says to us, analyze, look, and discuss it. Don't let it go. Don't let it say, it's nothing, it's only words. It's nothing, it will just go away. Stop and say, what is going on? Analyze and raise the alarm.
Yes, and especially in a country, in an African country like South Africa, like Zambia, that still has a lot of anger, a lot of unresolved issues from the past. When you start to use that kind of language that arouses those emotions of us and them, and power is involved, that is a recipe for disaster. And people have proven that when they are angry, when they are desperate, they are easy to influence, especially if you know how to use that kind of language to evoke that kind of emotion. That's very scary for me. Maybe South Africa is not at the point of destruction just yet, but the trend is leading towards that end of destruction, that violent destruction. So that is something all of us should worry about, especially in South Africa. Thank you, Tali, for explaining to us what happened in Zambia and how it links and how it relates to South Africa. Professor Carr, how does what happened in Zambia link or relate to the United States?
Well, thank you, Amadou. I just actually wanted to back up a little bit, though, and just kind of build on Andrea and Tali's point, in that I think we also need to pay attention to when the analogies don't quite line up, because those can tell us something as well. You were talking about before in terms of South Africa having its own kind of distinct history. Like, I think that information is important there. So the other thing I just wanted to sort of mention is that by training, I'm a film historian with a specialty in Hollywood during 1930s and 40s, which you might not necessarily think is relevant to study of the Holocaust or genocide. But I think it's really highly relevant in terms of some of the issues that we've already talked about. So I think, one of the things that I would, emphasize in terms of the United States context and actually the global context as well, is that, Hollywood, the film industry in the period that I study, as well as the media more generally, I think are they're sort of always an accessory in some ways before, during, and after a genocide. And I think it's important to recognize in this discussion that when we talk about the media, we're talking about a rather large and complex entity that's also very pluralistic. So that, when we talk about the media, we're talking about, the cell phone video that's taken by an amateur of some atrocity that's occurring, all the way up to the way in which multinational conglomerates produce global or programming for globalized audiences. So I mean, the media themselves are quite complex, and then at the same time, I think we should talk about the ways in which state-sponsored violence can use media, but also the ways in which media can figure as a target by totalitarian or fascist regimes. So just kind of jumping ahead to sort of think about, well, how does all this connect to the U.S.? Well, much of the same kind of rhetoric that Talia was talking about before was very much a part of, and I would argue still is a part of, the sort of toxic rhetoric that has occurred around immigration. In terms of talking about the film industry was regularly a target by xenophobic and anti-immigration forces who basically argued that the Jews had come into this country and again were infesting American business and were basically taking over this incredibly powerful communications medium, and essentially, the fear was brainwashing the American public. And so you kind of saw the way in which that late 19th century, early 20th century anti-immigration rhetoric sort of morphed into a kind of fomentation of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories involving Jews, like controlling the media. And I would say, like, that kind of energy, that targeting of groups doesn't go away. I mean, more recently, we've seen the same kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric that talks about infestation and vermin as targeting Asian Americans in this country, and sort of repeated hate crimes that violent hate crimes that have occurred. And we can't talk about those videos without talking about an entire year in which the former president repeatedly engaged sort of racist and coded rhetoric around the coronavirus.
But just to follow up on that, Professor Carr, why does hate speech work? Why does it succeed? Is it not because in the general society there's already a prejudice, and the person who's using the hate speech simply just ignites that, or they take from what is already in the society? Can you help us understand that? I'm
actually not so sure that hate speech always works, in part because it is so ham-fisted, it's so obvious. I think we can't talk about hate speech working without also talking about I think this is something that Andrea had alluded to earlier, as well as Tali. We can't talk about hate speech without talking also about dangerous speech. And here I'm sort of drawing from the work of the scholar Susan Benesch and her dangerous speech project. And I think it's important to look at hate speech within the context of, I'd say it's important to look at the directness of hate speech in the context of the sort of indirectness of dangerous speech. So, hate speech is direct, threatening, and it means to inflict immediate harm on people. But you can't get there without first kind of building up, for years, if not decades or even centuries, the sort of what Ben's calls dangerous speech, which is indirect and coded. And also I think dangerous speech works on fear-based appeals. I think personally, for me anyway, the danger of dangerous speech is in the sort of long-term and cumulative exposure. What dangerous speech does is it normalizes the steps that can lead to genocide incrementally. It normalizes hate speech, so that by the time a genocide actually occurs, it seems to the population, it seems perfectly natural and ordinary. And by the population, I certainly don't mean the people who are targeted for genocide through both hate speech and dangerous speech.
Mm. Wow, yeah, I've never thought about, so there's hate speech and then there's dangerous speech, and that relationship and how important it is to understand the relationship between those two concepts. And so, Professor Krondorfer, could you take us through in terms of the Holocaust and how these words and these images are linked to the Holocaust? And so from the Holocaust to now, that link, using that kind of language.
So the Nazis are surely not alone in using, propaganda and hate speech and hate ideology. But when we look back at them, they clearly were mastering and perfecting it in many ways. They took the media of their time, the social media of their time, and streamlined them, whether that was film or radio or public speeches or newspapers. And with that, they infiltrated every aspect of social life, of everyday life, with the terminology, with new terminology and with new language that was based on their bio-racist ideology and anti-Semitic ideology. In many ways, you can say they covered the whole spectrum very systematically and very intentionally. What in German is called the Gleichschaltung, across all these, making similar or making everyone goose step across the whole spectrum of social life. That includes the crude language of der Stürmer, which was a very outspoken anti-Semitic kind of magazine, to the very sophisticated language in the sciences, to visual propaganda on leaflets, on posters, and that's where we find these images that Tali alluded to earlier of rats and cockroaches and spiders and bloodsuckers and all of these images that are very powerful images, to more subtle language that we would today call euphemisms. Say like the term in German Umsiedlung, which means resettlement, which sounds like you're just transporting someone to another place, but it really meant transportation to death camps, or even the infamous language of the final solution or Endlösung in German, which could have many different meanings, but it really meant the genocide of the Jewish people in Europe. Then there are the kind of terms that actually, if you think about them, have two specific meanings. I use another example, the famous German term in the Nazi time called Lebensraum, which means living space, which meant basically it refers to the conquest of the territories in the East and to settle Germans into these newly conquered territories. So that was the living space for Germans, but implicitly it meant the expulsion, the transfer, and the death of unwanted local populations. So what is the living space for one is really the death space of someone else. So not only the outright hateful speech, but the euphemisms that are being used to allude to something that is understood is really important. And I think that is where it connects to what's happening today, at least in my country here in the United States, namely the power of propagandistic language. which is always built simultaneously in hope and on fear, and depends on who is targeted and who you're trying to reach. I think Adolf Hitler was a master of this kind of rhetorical moves and operations, really building up hope and promises for unified folk, for a unified German people, and at the same time excluding others with violent means. And so we have always kind of hope unifies a certain people, and fear is targeting other people by means of violent exclusion. And clearly we saw this in the United States in the last year. It came to kind of this pinnacle on January 6th with the insurrection at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And we saw the same power, really rhetorical power, played out on social media of today. I mean, everywhere. And, you know, we pitted like this rhetoric of a great America, which really meant a great white America, against immigrant populations, refugees, asylum seekers, Muslims, transgender people, brown people, the Antifa, and ultimately anyone who called himself or herself a Democrat. And I think on some level we were lucky this time around, but the danger of that language and the hate that this language generated clearly has not disappeared. It's still alive.
So Professor Patel, I want to bring you in, and that understanding between hate speech and dangerous speech. Why is it important for us to not ignore either hate speech or dangerous speech?
It's very important to recognize that hate speech and dangerous speech are both the signs of a structural failure. If this is happening, then there is a problem out there. And when I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that, you know, we are outraged and motivated and really agitated to do something, these 4 historians on this podcast, I very consciously use this emotional language. Because in the previous decades, what we see in the North modernity, that this is a disenchanted political language. And if you honestly, and the listeners honestly, try to think about, you know, politicians who are interesting and human and who are charismatic, they have got very few people whom they got in their mind. So in the past decades, what we see is this disenchantment of politics. And you have got this policy language, which is slightly boring, but very precise. And then this kind of language basically turns to be totally inadequate to address emotions and fears and uncertainty. And the 2008 economic, financial, and so-called migration crisis fundamentally changed the setup, and also the COVID presently. So we can also question if the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID is the trigger moment, which has been the 1929 financial crisis for the Nazi takeover and the kind of the wave which actually created the dark period for the European and global history. So this kind of economic, social, financial, and cultural crisis requires a language. And the language which is the easiest to use is the dangerous language and the hate speech, because we have been there. It worked in certain contexts. So when the spin doctors are looking for, you know, a language to use, and the different populist wannabes want to get the power, they have got a pretty well-developed cultural and linguistic repertoire to use. So, as I said, it's a sign that there is a problem, and we are looking for responses, and we don't have the language to address those issues in a kind of appealing and popular way. So that's why I think, for example, this discussion we are having here today is a possibility to think critically about the limits and the options and the opportunities, what kind of language we can use to address this obviously present different critical developments.
Director Nates, at the beginning, you actually did mention that we shouldn't ignore hate speech or dangerous speech as just, well, it'll just pass. It's just something that that person said. But it's an indication of something deeper. So can you just also tell us, why is it important for us to not ignore hate speech?
I will bring again the words that Bjorn used, their hope and fear. And we'll use also what Andrea offered us, in a time of crisis, maybe economic crisis, financial crisis, or a global pandemic where unemployment is growing, the economy is collapsing. The easiest tool in the hands of the powerful that wants to stay in power is to blame the other. And it is interesting when you look at it. Again, I will prefer to speak about us here in our continent, in our country. And I'll bring something that we didn't speak about before, xenophobia, Afrophobia. What is going on? Since 2008, the economic crisis, xenophobia started in South Africa, but not xenophobia in words. Sadly, it turned into actions, and we know that 62 people were murdered in 2008, and it's not going away. And during COVID, what we saw is marches. Nigerian's embassy in Pretoria kick all the foreigners out, not white foreigners. We are not talking about Europeans that are coming to a hotel in Sandton. We are talking about let's kick Africans out of South Africa. And violence, sadly, is all around us. Last month in Durban, your city, Mdu, where you were born, you know that it's getting out of hand. So where are we? Dangerous speech became hate speech and then became action. And it became, basically killing action. The book that we just launched 2 weeks ago, Brother, by photojournalist James Otway-Nalon Sky, first of all, is capturing and telling the stories of those Afrophobia, xenophobic attacks. Because the first thing that we need to do is not put our head in the sand. We need to talk about it. We need to write about it. And we need to raise our voices. We cannot just buy into the fear that Bjorn spoke about it and suggest a false hope that will make us feel better and think that there is no problem. There is problem. And this is just one of the many, but we do have to use education, awareness, and our skills of being together and raising those issues to air them out and not ignore them.
Wow, thank you for that, Talia. And then Professor Carr, some of the people who will be listening to this podcast are teachers, and some people are learner students, university students, high school students. How do you know if my free speech, my right to freedom of speech has now crossed over to hate speech? How do you know? How can you tell? Is there something you can tell us to say, well, now you've crossed the line. This is how you know.
Yeah, I don't know that you can, and I think some of this is going to involve taking some risks. I don't think there's an absolute formula to determine sort of when you've crossed over the line. But again, I'm sort of thinking back to Susan Benish's work on dangerous speech. That we have to recognize that all speech, hate, dangerous or otherwise, does not exist in a vacuum. right? That speech has a particular and specific context. And so I think what we need to do is we need to measure these statements within the context in which the specific context within they occur, right? So an isolated comment that might occur amongst a small group of friends might require a very different kind of response from a statement that is broadcast by a popular political figure who has an audience of millions, right? So like the response to each of those two instances is going to be very different, and of necessity is going to be sort of very tailored. So yeah, I guess I'm sure some listeners will be disappointed to realize that there isn't a simple answer to this question. But I guess what I would say is the best answer that I would have is that we have to be thoughtful and reflective in the moment in thinking about not just what's being said, but where it's being said, who's saying it, and who the audience is.
Bjorn?
An important task of the Martin Springer Institute I'm directing, and I would say also my teaching, my scholarship, is to dispel false certainties. And that certainly comes out of my own experience growing up in post-war, post-Holocaust West Germany, where I grew up in a fairly stable democracy, which I took for granted that this is how life should be, how political governance ought to be structured. But learning that there's always this shadow of the past, that there was a Weimar Republic and it fell apart, and Nazi Germany, with its worst genocidal policy that we have seen, came into power, just through sheer will of power and manipulation. So I certainly, through my own experience or my own growing up, I felt there's nothing certain unless we work for it. And that would be true for the United States now. We live here in this bubble of a nostalgic vision of what America is supposed to be. And the combination with that, with realpolitik, always we thought like there's absolutely no chance propagandistic language or conspiracy theories or hate ideology would enter the White House and be so devastating for in our particular context. And so I think a few things we could do. One is to be aware that we live in social bubbles because of our new technology, and to break into these bubbles is hard. And engaging with a media that is really propagandistic and full of hate probably doesn't help much to engage with people on Facebook, if that is the group where you're engaging in. But you do need to not forget that the people who propagandize hate ideology do this on a continuous stream of an undemocratic diet. It's like they never stop doing it. And we cannot underestimate that we have to use the same reassurance by using correct, truthful language to our groups and to fence sitters. And we cannot give up on the insistence on truthful language. So, I have like 4 or 5 like very short things that I wrote to myself in preparation, what we can do, like insist on using correct language, call out hateful rhetoric in public, reveal the codes of coded language, like the euphemisms I spoke about earlier, employ humor and irony. That sometimes is really sustaining. And because I get this asked so often, what do we do with our own families and close friends? And here I would say we need to be patient with our families and our close friends if they think differently than we do, and yet remain consistent in our own language that is truthful and accurate. So these are the few things I think we at least can be aware of in our own daily practice and when we teach and do scholarly work.
Yes, before I move on to Professor Petrou, I want to give her a chance as well. But can you explain, when you say use humor, what do you mean, in what way, when you're talking about hate speech and dangerous speech?
Hate speech and dangerous speech has the power to actually wants you to respond to it. It wants to unify one group, but wants to antagonize the other group. And I, for myself, as well as other people, I feel kind of drawn into this hate speech and and it makes my day miserable without it becoming productive. And so I'm getting angry or counter angry. And then if that would be in the street, it would be counter aggression. Irony and humor kind of puts things a little bit into perspective. So like, there's actually a bigger world out there that does not fall into the traps of what the hate speech is doing to its followers, but also the people they want to antagonize. And so it's very soothing for us to have humor and irony. Obviously, that doesn't work for the people who propagandize hate speech, but it works for those who are the victims of hate speech.
Okay, that makes sense. Professor Patel, what would you, yes.
I just would like to follow up what Bjorn said about what can we do. And I want to bring in, my personal strategy. What others can do, that's your responsibility. If you can look into the mirror every morning and every evening, that what did you do to save the world in that particular day? What I'm doing, and maybe this is important for the listeners, that not only Central European University was forced to exile by simple lies and outward hatred by the present government of Hungary, but also gender studies, and I'm a professor of gender studies, had been crossed out from the accredited study list without any explanation, and then some very kind of ad hoc and simply false explanation. So in the past years, gender studies, gender equality became this targets of hate speech, and also harassment on the in the public sphere, harassment in the digital sphere, and I received kind of different types of very ugly emails, including death threats, which of course the Hungarian police refused to investigate. So in a sense, the fear and being harassed became a part of our everyday reality. And I think this is also a part of the aim of this hate speech, that you will feel yourself threatened, and somehow you would feel that your borders and your space is shrinking. So what I was doing is, and I'm doing, is that partly being very active in social media, trying to go out from my bubble. So if I'm invited by those whose views I totally disagree, I accept invitations to different TV channels, radio channels, at that time when they dared to invite me, not anymore. In the past year, this invitation ceased to exist. But only if I can frame the discussion. So I never accepted invitation when there was one supporting gender studies and the other was against gender studies, because then your arguments, they are basically accepting the framing of the language of this whole discussion. So I think humor is very, very important, what Bjorn was mentioning, but I would never dare to use irony in this posts and these comments, because then it will not go well, in a sense that they do not, and Bjorn also mentioned that irony is basically undetectable and undecodable by those people who believe that they have the truth now. And they are just clinging on a belief and on an information like they don't have anything else. But what I'm using is my authority as an expert, as a person with 6 doctorates, right? A person who is reliable, and I'm sharing my expert opinion. And I'm using data, I'm referring to the different sources. And if I manage to convince one single person who was reading that particular Facebook thread or Twitter thread or Instagram thread, then I already achieved something. And of course, this is horribly time consuming, but this is, I think, what academics should do in the 21st century, to move out from the ivory tower and try to engage actively with the world around us, because who else would speak about professional issues if not those who are actually the professionals?
Wow. Thank you for that. Director Nates, what do you recommend people do in response to hate speech and dangerous speech?
I will just end with a little story. In South Africa, there was a certain individual that used Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and so on to, to post admiration posts for Adolf Hitler, and Holocaust denial and all sorts of that kind of thing during COVID last year. A 99-year-old Holocaust survivor, Ella Blumenthal, took it upon her to do exactly what Andrea said. She wrote, I would say, a loving letter to that individual and said, whatever you heard is you heard the wrong people. Come, I want to talk to you. I want to tell you what I went through, and I wish that what you thought is a lie was a lie. If it was, I would not I would not have lost 98 members of my family. And this little story of actually repositioning yourself, educating, not giving up, continuing to engage and raising awareness. It's a tiny little story of a 99-year-old Holocaust survivor that certainly won that little battle.
So Professor Carr, I want to ask you the same question. How do we respond to hate speech or dangerous speech?
Well, I think in terms of a response, this kind of goes back to what I was saying before. I think that we have to think about tailoring our responses in terms of the context in which it occurs, and finding, the right kind of, the right kinds of channels, and also the right kind of content to sort of match up with the speech acts that are occurring. It's something that I think Andrea had mentioned before, that I think is kind of important, and even I think the example that Tali used with the survivor is that in some ways I think the response is not a one-off response. That in some ways the responses are kind of like an endurance test. For those of us who feel engaged with these issues and want to remain vigilant in terms of preventing genocide and the steps that lead to genocide. I think I just would close by saying I think in the end what makes this really hard is you cannot truly predict with certainty what response is going to be effective or what response is going to work. But that should not stop us from engaging all the available resources that we have to make educated guesses as far as what an effective response looks like. And again, an effective response, I think, is one that embodies all the things that we've talked about. Bjorn had talked about kind of accuracy and specificity, that we have to, come up with facts, that we have to sort of, keep in mind the human factor to, in all this. But, again, I think that, there's not going to be a one size fits all response, that the best response is the one that's tailored to the immediate communication moment.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you everyone once again, thank you for being part of this conversation. For you, the listener, thank you for joining us in today's podcast. Please be sure to tune in to the next part of this series on our focus on democracy with our experts and panelists. If you have any questions for the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre and our experts in today's conversation, please send them to us and we'll make sure to include those answers in our future podcasts, which you can find on our SoundCloud page. Please be sure to visit our website, which is www.jhbholocaust.co.za for more information and resources. Thank you to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for making this podcast possible. Keep well and safe.